CGS, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure, as always, to address the Land Warfare Conference, and a particular pleasure to be chaired by General Sandhurst, who I've known since he was a potential officer with my squadron in Germany. Yes, you've got it. We evidently impressed him so little that afterwards he went to the Green Jackets instead. Just think, Patrick, if you hadn't, where you could be today. Well, my brief is to provide a historical taster, a lead into the session, specifically those points. A historical perspective on a future of unprecedented fundamental change. I'm not sure how intellectually viable that is, but I was also told to try and be light and not miserable, so I hope to achieve one of the aims at least. Emphasis also on this business of being devolved, training and innovation, tactical innovation at its best when it's devolved. And I've only got a quarter of an hour or so, so all I'm really going to be able to do is cast a few pebbles into the thinking pond, so to speak. At least it means I shan't be tempted to use the session to promote my historical novels. Well, not much. And you know, that's a pity, because they would help me make a point about the difference between the changing character of conflict and its enduring nature. You must have a powerful imagination to write 12 historical novels, say some of my readers. No, I reply, all I do is reverse engineer my own experience of soldiering into the early 19th century, because the essence of conflict doesn't change, because it's first about the man, not the weapon. And despite everything we've heard about the unprecedented change in the character of conflict, I believe that if I were writing these novels in, say, 10, 15, or even 20 years' time, I could take the same approach. That's a prediction, and predictions are dangerous, but you know where I'm going. I also wonder if, in focusing on the changing character of conflict, as we have been doing, and we will be prone to do for obvious reasons, we risk becoming too specific and predictive rather than focusing on the need for adaptability and the means for adaptability. Do we not risk also the conceit of the present, fostering the idea that future warfare will be so different that this year isn't 2017 with all that's gone before, but year zero, and in the search for innovation in training, we start ditching the wisdom of the ages. Well, enough of promoting my historical fiction. I'm supposed to be dealing with historical fact. And I hardly need promote my latest real history, because the CGS chose it as his book of the year in the Times last Christmas, so I imagine all those in uniform here will have read it or are intending to. But I do want to return later to the war that we nearly lost, because of what it tells us about the perils of wrongly anticipating changes in the character of conflict and the implications for training. Now, surely the whole value of history for soldiers is that it warns against the ever-present risk of tactical complacency, while at the same time confirming what it is in the nature of war that endures. And the longer the view you have of history, the more it warns and the more it confirms. So let's begin by delving deep in the British Army's 357 years continuous history, though I'll skip the first 100 years, though they have plenty of lessons too. And in deference to General Hodges, I want to begin in America in July 1755 on the Monongahela River near what is now Pittsburgh. It's a really good example of entering on a campaign with tactical doctrine optimized for campaigning elsewhere. In 1755, we were fighting the French. We were most years. And Major General Edward Braddock, with a young Colonel George Washington as his American ADC, advanced into the backwoods almost literally with the axe to carve out roadways, with 2,200 regulars and colonial militia intending to capture Fort Duquesne and cut the line of French outposts between the St. Lawrence and the Ohio rivers. The British Army of that time had been fighting in continental Europe off and on since the Duke of Marlborough's day, and their organization and tactics were that of a great continental army, mass, with movement in close, controlled order. Braddock's advance column was ambushed by French troops and their Huron Indian allies, which was portrayed with a good deal of artistic license, but also a good deal of drama in The Last of the Mohicans. When Braddock's men showed initiative and innovation by seeking cover, Braddock cursed them back into line, where they continued to fire volley after volley into the neutral trees. Defeat followed. Braddock's dying words, for real, were, "We shall know better another time." Now, unwittingly, he was in fact stating British operational practice, which seems to have continued ever since. Lose, it's funny what people laugh at, I hadn't expected. Lose the opening battles of a war, adapt, retrain, and then take the fight back successfully to the enemy. And his prediction was correct. They did know better another time. The following year, they formed ranger companies raised locally, modeled on colonial frontiersmen who were adept with the rifle rather than the musket and could use movement, stealthy movement. And light infantry companies were formed within the battalions of the line, the training improvised at regimental level. These innovations, in combination with disciplined volleys of musketry at the right time and place, ultimately neutralized the Indian auxiliaries and beat the French. I'm simplifying, of course, and if you're really interested, you can read more about it here. Now you laugh. But actually, I put this up to make a point about another problem the Army always faces when peace comes. This is the cover my publishers wanted for the American edition. They thought it would be an attractive expression of the special relationship, British and American officers exchanging compliments, etc. What they hadn't twigged, which you are twigging, I can see, is that this wasn't an exchange of compliments, but General Sir John Burgoyne surrendering after Saratoga in 1777, one of the first battles of the American Revolutionary War. Why were we defeated this time? Well, it's complicated, but one of the reasons was that the army had relapsed into European tactics, tactical recidivism. Well, Saratoga was a pretty minor skirmish in the backwoods of what is now New York State, but the surrender had enormous strategic implications. It brought the French in on the American colonists' side. The French Navy quickly established control of the American coast, and without the ability to move troops in theater by sea, the British Army was ultimately defeated. And failure, we know, can have strategic consequences, not least in defense policy. After the loss of the colonies, the British government made a huge strategic overcorrection. Its defense planning assumptions ruled out large-scale land campaigns in the future and instead embraced sea control. So, to the great neglect of the Army, after 1783, every available penny went into aircraft carriers. I mean big ships. And by the time we came to fight the French again in the Revolutionary and then the Napoleonic Wars, the Army was in a pretty sorry state. It pulled through only by a combination of rapid innovation at the tactical level, such as the rediscovery of light infantry tactics, driven by a number of younger officers at Shorncliffe, but also by recognizing that at the right time and place, disciplined volleys from the heavy infantry couldn't be beaten. It was all a question of balance between innovation and the tried and tested. And also because just enough commanders of high caliber had stuck with their profession during the lean years. How do we keep the future Wellingtons in the Army in the lean years ahead? But back to that initial assumption, does history show that training is at its best when the challenge and innovation is devolved? No, I think that's too black and white. Let me cite an example from the not too distant past, and one that was surrogate warfare par excellence. Those of us who served in BAOR during the Cold War will remember how every day was a demonstration to the Soviet Third Shock Army just across the inner German border, who did scare us in a way that Igor described today, that we're meant to be scared by those slides. Every day was a demonstration to Third Shock Army that we were ready and able to defeat an attack. The endless command post exercises, the surprise inspections to check on a unit's ability to outload its ammunition and get to its deployment area, the annual round of brigade, divisional, and then corps field training exercises, the international gunnery competitions, the patrol competitions, the polo matches. And all the while, our radio traffic was monitored and then analyzed by the Russians, and our movement closely observed on the ground by SOCSMIS, the Soviet military mission in the West. And you know, I digress just a bit here, we used to be told that we, the Allies, got far more out of the exchange of military missions than did the Russians, for while they had to give us access to what was otherwise concealed behind the Iron Curtain, everything of ours was on open display. But actually, in retrospect at least, that missed the most important aspect of the exchange. It wasn't just about SOCSMIS acquiring intelligence and us acquiring intelligence on the Soviets. It was about us demonstrating capability and resolve. And we didn't know how well we were doing it. One of these SOCSMIS officers actually defected to the West. And during his interrogation by the intelligence services, actually by Christopher Donnelly, who I hope some of you have heard of, he's still around, he's still a great Sovietologist, one of those defectors said that one of the reasons for his defecting was that he realized that if they did attack 1st British Corps, they wouldn't stand a chance. Donnelly, somewhat incredulously, asked why, to which the Russian replied, "You have Chieftain." Astonishing, really, because at the time, the Chieftain tank's mean distance between breakdowns was about 10 miles. But my point is that intensive training had the byproduct of demonstrating to the enemy, and indeed to our allies, that we were a force to be reckoned with. And it didn't half help when occasionally we could prove it, such as in the Falklands. In that respect, I think Iraq and Afghanistan will surely count for a few years more, what I'd call the Army's operational capital. But actually, the training in BAOR was both devolved and imposed. BAOR warriors will remember just what an impact this man, General Nigel Bagnall, now dead, had on the 1st British Corps when he took command. Almost overnight, out went the dozen or so different and highly individualistic brigade concepts of operations and the multiplicity of regimental ideas. And instead, in came a unified, realistic, and robust doctrine of mechanized warfare. And we know now what an impact this and his subsequent appointment as commander of the Northern Army Group had on his opposite number in 3rd Shock Army. Now, Bagnall was his own man, but he studied history deeply. German history of the Second World War, Russian armored history in the Second World War, Israeli history in the recent wars. And in particular, he'd studied the training methods of this man. During the so-called phony war in France in 1939 and 40, the then Major General Bernard Montgomery was commanding the 3rd Division. We had 10 divisions in France in 1940. Monty ignored instructions to train for positional defense and instead trained for withdrawal in contact, because that, he reckoned, was the hardest thing that anyone could be asked to do. At dusk every day, his division would be occupying a notional defensive position. As soon as it was dark, he would issue orders to take up a new position by first light 10 miles further back, on a line at a right angle to the previous one and in radio silence, a demanding test of battle procedure, command and control, navigation, and logistics. Not surprisingly, during the withdrawal to Dunkirk, his division was one of the few to retain coherence. It wasn't just that he'd guessed well what they'd really have to do. By training generically, he achieved tactical handiness. No matter what they'd been called on to do, they could have done it. Remember what Wellington said about the army after the Peninsular War. I could have taken it anywhere and done anything with it. As I said, top down or bottom up, these things aren't either or. The challenge is to recognize best practice. And that's one of the big lessons of the First World War, the war that we nearly lost. There's still a lot of talk about the Army's so-called learning curve between 1914 and 1918. I have my doubts about this curve. In many places, it was a flat line. But what isn't in doubt is that innovation, when it was allowed, came largely from the bottom up, and in many cases from men who'd not been in uniform before 1914. And yet, the famous 15 rounds a minute, which the regulars of the BEF deployed to such effect, perhaps even decisive effect, in August and September 1914, was a top-down innovation from the Small Arms School at Hythe. Having studied the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5, the school lobbied the War Office to increase the proposed machine gun allocation from 2 to 6 per battalion. But when this was rejected, partly on grounds of cost, but also because the Vickers machine gun sections were man and horsepower intensive and not very agile, they developed instead the technique of rapid fire, reversing the earlier enthusiasm for training in long-range marksmanship, which was one of the lessons of the Boer War. They argued that in Europe, fields of fire of even 800 yards would be unusual, with 300 to 400 the norm, the point at which, as German tactics stressed, the final assault would be launched. So they speeded up the rate of fire at the expense of pinpoint accuracy to achieve what they call Browning fire, fire that forced mass attacks to take cover. And we know, of course, that they were proved right. In fact, this improvised response was far better than giving the infantry 6 rather than 2 machine guns and a great deal of barbed wire, which was the other lesson of the Russo-Japanese War. Because all that would have happened in August 1914 was that the BEF would have laid miles of barbed wire in the wrong place and then lost most of their machine guns in the scramble of the 200-mile withdrawal to the River Marne. What was needed in those opening months was as many infantrymen as possible practiced in fire and movement. But it did also need then, when both sides had dug in from the North Sea to the Swiss border, for the High Command to recognize that advancing against machine guns and barbed wire needed more than just guts and a public school education. The Army spent too long trying to adapt the situation on the Western Front to their doctrine of battle, rather than the other way around. Well, I'm coming to the end, but I just want to say a word or two about those pre-1914 years, which, like BAOR in the Cold War, are fascinating years to study as how to demonstrate capability and resolve during peacetime, and how not to. The Germans conducted massive annual maneuvers. I think we all know that. What a wonderful slide of the technology of the aeroplane and the trumpet and the horse. You've got several centuries in one slide there. But they had a lot of men. That was the point. They conducted these massive annual maneuvers in part to drill their conscripts, in part to test commanders and staff, and in part to impress, indeed overawe, the rest of Europe. And they were certainly liberal with their invitations to foreign observers. The more influential, the better, the Kaiser with young Winston. From 1910, we did the same, but our all-regular expeditionary force was very much smaller than the nation in arms that the Germans were exercising, and it cut little ice with the Kaiser. Remember how during the Prusso-Danish War in the 1860s, when a nervous official asked the Iron Chancellor what he'd do if a British army landed on the coast of Prussia, Bismarck said he'd send a policeman to arrest it. I don't believe the Kaiser ever did call the BEF a contemptible little army in 1914, but he did say after the war that he might have said it was contemptibly little. So, we must be careful when exercising to deter. There are leaders of unfriendly powers, as well we know, that see things principally in terms of numbers. But showing no interest, however small, in an area of potential conflict is an invitation for every tin pot chancer to gamble. That's why the Falklands War began, and to an extent the Gulf War. Who knows, therefore, what effect a few companies of infantrymen, or better still, a couple of squadrons of light cavalry, can have, training in the arc of instability, while, of course, larger-scale NATO exercises up the stakes for Mr. Putin, the new great game. So, in conclusion, history can be on our side if we let it be. It's about speed of adaptability and balance of judgment. The British Army has suffered only one true strategic defeat, I mean lost a war in its 357-year history. And that defeat may well prove to have been a blessing, but it's still too early to tell.
There's nothing quite so smooth as a cavalry put down. So I drew three things from that. This enduring theme of the conceit of the present and the importance of being adaptable and not simply prediction. Secondly, perhaps holding a mirror up to ourselves, how do we replicate the tempo and scale of training that the British Army on the Rhine conducted, difficult for us today. And thirdly, I was caught by this idea of a reputational half-life on the back of an operation, and when does that half-life begin to expire? What is interesting is that the leading question by some distance is about failure in training, and so there's no one better placed, I think, to give us an insight into that than Gareth Bloomfield, who lectures in the psychology of leadership and runs an internal mental resilience program, and of course is key at Sandhurst. And that's what Gareth's going to do for the next 10 minutes or so, is just take a view inside people's brains and how you fail.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to do something different, stand away from the podium so you can see my fear of failure in full view. I've already made a mistake because I'm wearing light brown shoes with a dark suit, as the Army Sergeant Major has noticed, and obviously some of you have noticed as well. Okay, they said, Gareth, you're good at failure, do this bit. So what I want to do is take you through a neurological view of failure and some of the things that are happening to us during training and what failure may bring. Some of you will recognise these sorts of pictures from your training, either within Sandhurst or other organisations. Right now, for me, this is pretty scary up here, because there are predators out here for me. There are people who could mark my card, who could effectively make me lose my job. Actually, there's no other environment a bit like this where your heart rate begins to go up, your mouth gets dry, you start to lose your words, your ability to remain human starts to collapse, just like it was in the face of your colour sergeant, if you remember back then, when he was bawling at you about the failure that had just become you on a section attack, or wherever that may have been. There is no other place. We do not come out of our gates in the morning at home, we don't come out of our doors and look up and down and say, is there a lion out here that may get us? But we do that within our training establishments. The cadets open the doors and they look up and down and they go, is the colour sergeant here? Is my captain here? Is there somebody here that could be a predator? Let's have a think about what actually is control and fear of losing control. What is failure, if you like? It is that fear of losing control. It is that fear of getting up and making a presentation, That is giving your orders and getting it completely wrong. Just standing there jiggling something in your pocket and nobody really hears what you're saying. They're just listening to the jiggling in your pocket. There's something else that's going on. You lose control, and actually, as you lose control, your stress increases. The more control that I feel over something, the less stress that I feel. So actually what we're talking about here with regards to training is looking at training and seeing people lose control of the objective. That may be tactical, that may be human, that may be something else, but it's actually control of what it is that they're there to achieve. Let's have a look inside our brains. This is my brain. This is me doing some experiments on EEGs and MRI scanners. There are some important parts of the brain, and most of them are centered right in the center of the brain. Amygdala, locus coeruleus, hypothalamus. The prefrontal cortex is the only bit that isn't. It's the bit that actually makes us different from bonobo chimps, chimpanzees, rhesus monkeys. Our nearest living relatives don't have a prefrontal cortex. There's about half a pound of difference between our brain and their brain. We have a prefrontal cortex. It's the bit that took us, I've heard it described as the bit that took us out of the trees and into a shopping centre. Monkeys have the ability to do puzzles. They like doing puzzles, but what they can't do is pick up an IKEA catalogue and go, oh, I want one of them. They can't think about it in that sort of context in terms of where would it go, the planning, the risk of putting it there or not putting it there. So all of these things actually, most of them, are in the center of the brain, which actually is, from an evolutionary point of view, is our, you've heard it probably called the reptilian brain, or if you've read Chimp Paradox, it will be that sort of, it's the chimp part of the brain. But actually it's a very, very early stage of the brain. We share these parts of the brain with every walking animal. Every walking animal on this earth, and dolphins and other things. There's two sides of this equation going on when you are in the face of failure and undergoing training. One is this autonomic nervous system that is producing noradrenaline. On the other side is this hypothalamus pituitary gland, which is taking a bit longer, but both of these sides, both of these reactions are having a major effect on how we think as human beings, how we make decisions, and what we do. Effectively, what happens is that as our stress level increases and cortisol is injected and adrenaline is coming through our bodies, our ability to be a human being, that is, make rational human decisions, begins to switch off. And I've seen it many times. You watch cadets, you watch young officers in particular stressful situations, and effectively, they are a reptile. They are not making the decisions that you want them to make. But that goes for any of us. Any of us who have ever experienced road rage. Any of us who have experienced a sudden increase in stress when our child has done something and we just... We're not a human being in that particular time. We are turning into a reptile because of what happens to our brains, what shuts down. What I'm going to suggest to you is actually, in training, maybe, just maybe, we need to be in a better place. Because what we do know is that the levels of cortisol do make a memory stronger. They do make a memory stronger. That's why, for most of us, most of our earliest memories will be negative, because actually they are ringed with cortisol. But cortisol also hangs around in the body it actually gets to its peak about 25, 40 minutes after the stressful event, and can seriously impair our judgment and our ability to remain rational and a human thinker. We need the ability to be able to switch on stressful situations for young officers and cadets, to remind them that they will never, ever, ever put themselves in that situation again. Because that's the cortisol that will bring those networks, those memory networks into place. But we also need that ability to be able to switch that off and actually have positive drivers that actually allow that individual to perform at a higher level and to become more creative. So I'll let you read, I'm not going to read this to you, I'll let you read some of the dangers of stress. So in training, effectively what we're doing was putting young people whose brains haven't fully developed yet, because the prefrontal cortex doesn't really fully develop until perhaps mid-20s. We're putting people through stressful events that actually are probably counterproductive to real learning and actually possibly counterproductive to creativity. So here's something to wake you up. Here's your challenge. You have got to move one matchstick in each of these equations to make them correct. You've got to move one matchstick to make these equations correct. Right, so I can hear people talking about it already. The first one, you move a 5 into a 10, which is basically moving an x into a v into an x. Yeah? Now, what's surprising is this, is that I can give you 30 of these equations where the answer is pretty similar every time. That is, moving a 5 into a 10, a v into an x or an x into a v. I could give you 30 of those equations where, and I make you an expert by giving you 30 equations where you have to move one matchstick and you have to change an x into a v or a v into an x. That then makes you unable to do the second one. And the second one is simply changing a plus sign into an equal sign. Yet my 11-year-old daughter can do the second one, but actually, now some of you are probably saying, no, that wouldn't happen to me. But it does. Actually, repetition is one of the traps that we fall in. We train our people that under stress, what they should do is fall into habit. That's why we do drills. That's why we do drills. We do drills time and time and time again. So when the stress hits, obviously what they do is default into habitual behavior. We make them experts, in this analogy, of changing x's into v's or v's into x's. But what that does is disables their creativity and adaptability. So if we are joining two things together, which is constant failure within training and the constant stress of thinking, oh no, what is this failure going to do to me? Am I going to be put on report? Am I actually going to pass this? Am I actually good enough to be here? All those negative thoughts that come across with that. We impair learning because the predators are out there as they're learning. They're being watched all the time. And we do these drills that make them fall into habitual behavior. When it goes wrong, you do this, you do this, you do this. That obviously then becomes predictable to those people who we are fighting. All they have to do is put us under stress, and we will default into habitual behavior. Not only will we default into habitual behavior, but actually what we will do is go high risk. So in this situation where I'll never put myself in this situation again, what males do is they tend to throw everything at it. So it's going wrong. It's a stressful situation. I am now losing the ability as a human being to make a proper decision. I'm now defaulting into habitual behavior, and one of those things that I do as a male is I throw everything at it. The risk goes up. and I meet that risk, I start doing riskier behaviours. Actually, females don't do that. So maybe, here's my final little thing to you, is maybe we use neurological evidence and we say, there's something different that we could do. Maybe if we want our decision makers to be adaptable and we want them to be people who are creative, then maybe we do it at a slower pace. That costs money because it means the course is longer. Maybe we have less repetition, so actually we're not getting people to default into things that then become predictable. But then that's dangerous too, isn't it? Because the reason we respond in this room differently to people out there, if a bomb goes off in London, we will respond differently because we've learnt the drills. It's only later that we actually think about it. But maybe we need more tricks to stimulate creative thinking, which is about turning off that habitual behaviour when the stress comes in. Maybe we look at gender command choices, because actually when it goes wrong, if the males are now performing at a higher risk level and chucking everything at it, maybe they lose sight of stability objectives, maybe they lose sight of civilian objectives, of the promises they made in Assura to someone during a meeting. Maybe they lose sight of those things because actually they're no longer processing at a human level. Maybe also we have to consider actually the levels of positive and negative feedback. That's my little proposal to you.
We can come back to that in questions. So next up is Karen Peake, who is Chief of Staff, 1 RT Brigade, who is going to set out for us the work that they have been doing on the Battlecraft syllabus and what it has meant in terms of what we train for, but also how we train, which are some of the more interesting insights. Karen.
Thanks, sir. The modern battlefield, it's complex, it's multidimensional. It's fought in cyberspace, in the Twitter sphere, in a denied environment, on the plains in the cities. So how do we develop our ability to fight in this environment, to win? Through training. We need to exploit the time, space, and resources we have better. This afternoon, I'll be highlighting our current work to create a new Battlecraft syllabus, aimed at providing a training solution from first principles to reflect the new contemporary threat spectrum. Through a conscious refocusing on the basics of soldiering and low-level training up to unit level, the Battlecraft syllabus aims to produce an evolution in the way the Army delivers training to the lowest level. It reflects the enduring nature of war, but in a way that recognises a shift in training cultures and is cognizant of resource realities. 1st Artillery Brigade has been empowered to create and implement the Joint Fires Battlecraft syllabus, and I would like to highlight 3 areas in which we are looking to innovate our training to meet the next generation threat. Firstly, by encouraging a cultural shift in our attitude to training. For approximately 80% of the Army, the lens that training is viewed through is very op entirety focused. Training is something that was done to you rather than by you. The majority of the Army has therefore little experience of training themselves. The Battlecraft syllabus seeks to provide the framework, syllabus, and resources to enable self-training. Simply expecting a group of soldiers to train themselves without providing the context, framework, and resources by which to achieve it is not going to work. What tools do we think we need? Time, space, and an adjustment in the way we use our resources. The Battlecraft syllabus seeks to create a training regime which provides all 3 and able to provide our soldiers and officers the ability to train themselves. In outline, it aims to break training away from being a linear, programmed progression where training was done to you, to one where units train themselves through a more coherent and efficient use of time and resources. In order to better understand how we can tackle the question of time, we have, with support from McKinsey, studied the use of time in a close support artillery unit within 1st Artillery Brigade. Focused exclusively on how time was spent in barracks, the work has already provided evidence to reinforce the intuition that junior soldiers have spare time to undertake the training envisaged under the battlecraft syllabus, but a bottleneck lies with the middle management of a unit, who we would previously have expected to plan and deliver the bulk of the training. Thus, efficiencies must be made to free up time for the organisation and delivery of training. Ongoing work therefore seeks to identify how to unlock time at this level. In particular, the battlecraft syllabus seeks to remove the binary approach to the use of time. For example, instead of equipment care and training being 2 draws on our time, merging the activities would create both time efficiencies and opportunity. The provision of the correct resources is a key aspect to battlecraft syllabus delivery. Much can be done at low level with limited resources. The execution of sets and reps of battle drills can instill effective and efficient skills which will be the bedrock of most training activity. As demonstrated recently on 3 UK divisions warfighter exercise in the US, being competitive in the fight relied on well-executed battle drills to assist in the creation of tempo. Gaining seconds was crucial, particularly in areas such as the counter-fires fight. Practiced, proficient drills will make the subsequent use of more expensive and limited resources, such as live ammunition, more effective. The availability to equipment to those troops not in their training year is therefore crucial to enable low-level training. I would suggest that a large proportion of armoured troops could survive and live in their vehicles, but the ability to fight them in a high-tempo battlefield is a skill that has faded over the past decade. Having regular access to these vehicles and the communication and data systems that come with them is key to ensuring the development of enduring combat skills. The answer is not necessarily more resources, but we can be more flexible in how we manage and allocate those resources we do have. If our approach to training is going back to first principles, then our approach to the management of the resources to enable that training should too. Overall, coherent communication is key to selling this concept, and we need to ensure our troops understand the rationale behind this new training initiative, as they are sceptical of yet more change. As this syllabus is aimed at the detachment, section, platoon and subunit level, this rationale needs to be communicated to the lowest levels of the Army. The emphasis on training ourselves leads to our second requirement, empowerment. By design, the battlecraft syllabus is a bottom-up approach to training, with the detachment, troop or platoon as the base building block, within a construct that focuses on the subunit and the unit level. Well-trained detachments underpin well-trained subunits and units. As such, detachment commanders are responsible for the continuous delivery of training to their detachment through all stages of the battlecraft syllabus. This addresses empowerment by forcing it structurally. However, the chain of command may need to accept a dip in capability initially, whilst junior commanders develop the experience to be confident in training themselves, and the training culture shift is achieved. The role of the subunit commander to enable the training, and then prepare the detachment to operate in a troop and subunit context. The role of the unit commander is to enable and ensure the subunit is prepared to operate in a regimental context as part of the joint fire systems. Overall, commanding officers through to detachment commanders are empowered within a policy and assurance mechanism, but the empowerment will need it to be tangible for it to work. This has implications for more effective use of vehicle fleets, the requirement to address undue safety restrictions in training, and being more efficient in the use of time. A wider look at the programme and priorities will be needed. We need to acknowledge there are still risks to empowerment and implementation, which we're seeking to address with Field Army. Finally, the context in which this is being delivered needs to evolve. A moderated approach to doctrine would be helpful. The requirement for enduring doctrine remains, which reflects the nature of war and our more technical publications. However, a more agile approach to some levels of doctrine, especially in the fight-tonight timeframe, would embrace the constant evolution of the character of conflict. We need to embrace complexity as the new normal. The modern battlefield is multi-domain, and our training must evolve to reflect this. operating at night against a heightened electronic warfare and cyber threat needs to become second nature to our soldiers at the lowest levels. Commanders need to think, how would I win against me? And implement training regimes accordingly. We need a training delivery mechanism that is not linear in its construct, but one that can be incorporated into both daily routine and evolve to complex technical and tactical exercises. It must be a spectrum of training that can be delivered to both regular and reserves. In terms of joint fires specifically, an ability to train the multi-domain fires network is fundamental. Our methodology has been to better link joint fires training to tactical activities through the use of core battle drills, which can be adjusted to varying levels of complexity. We also need to be able to exercise the spectrum of the joint fires network. Only by regularly doing the sets and reps as a joint team beforehand at all levels can we become properly accomplished. If we don't, then the training only really starts once already on the battlefield. It is now inconceivable that our warfighting context would not involve the requirement to leverage joint and multinational capabilities, and thus getting our own processes right before we're launched into a complex joint and coalition environment is essential. Our recent experience in executing operations on Exercise Warfighter with 3 UK Division and 18th Airborne Corps has unquestionably proven this requirement. The provision of and access to suitable simulation and the wider joint team would greatly assist in developing our familiarity with our own processes before we hit H-hour. In summary, a genuine focus on the revision of the context in which we train, a ruthless determination to empower commanders to provide innovative and challenging training. Both are required in order to enable a cultural shift in our approach to training. An honest appraisal of current policy restrictions, an approach to resource management that goes back to first principles. All are required if we are to instill a combat ethos, ruthlessly drive change, and make training sufficiently challenging before we hit the battlefield. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, I'm now going to ask Alex Alderson, who probably needs little introduction after 29 years in the Army. He's also a senior visiting fellow at King's College, London's War Studies Department, and is working for Saab. And Alex is going to give us an insight into how we can develop a partnership with industry to facilitate some of the training ends that we've identified that we want.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to talk this afternoon. This is not a pitch from one company. I took some views from other companies that are involved in delivering, supporting your training. And the 3 main points that will make up this short presentation, this short discussion really, of the challenges that you face in training, were signed up to by those other companies. This is a generally held view of where we are. The question that I was set was, how can partnership with industry support expeditionary training and unlock innovation via virtual reality, augmented reality, synthetic training, and multi-domain battle lanes? There was an etc. at the end of that list. And I can see that there are clear links between the question that we've been set and the collective training sustainment program that's going on, the collective training review, and the still unfunded .cl, which would deliver significant simulation for the Army. I'm not going to give you a beauty pageant of attractive new technologies that will catch the eye. I'm not going to give you a portfolio of things that you should consider, because actually, week to week, we have that conversation with DE&S and with those who are involved in putting training ideas together for the Army. So that's an ongoing conversation. What I am going to do is go through these points. Use CGS's 4 points about training yesterday as some context. Identify some of the constraints that I think you face. Talk a little bit about partnership, because the world has gone quiet since the heady days of the early discussion of the Army training partnership some 5 years ago. Give you some thoughts about Army training strategy design, the roles that we could play in delivering training, and finally, inevitably, something about commercial adaptation. So yesterday, CGS gave us 4 points about training. Training, number one, is surrogate warfare. And there's a deduction that falls out of this, that the training environment that you create must be as realistic and immersive as possible. Now, my focus throughout the next few slides will be on live simulation, that is, live soldiers doing training and supported by some form of simulation, doing the things that they would normally do on the battlefield. But that question of realism is highly important. You must avoid the temptation of a training system and the use of simulation that somehow distorts or gets in the way of the tasks and the equipment that the soldier will use. The next thing is that training delivers fighting spirit. Fighting is a physical activity, and true, you can do quite a lot in the virtual domain, but be absolutely clear, at this stage, the virtual domain has its limits. Now, it's highly useful for platform-orientated training. In the air domain in particular, sometimes in the maritime, you've got it largely at the combined arms tactical training. But when it comes to dismounted soldiers in close combat, that virtual domain definitely has some limitations. Training provides a laboratory for your capability and force development. Well, that depends on you having the ability to capture a lot of data and then have the ability to exploit it in slow time to analyze trends and to see and to test ideas out. And actually, for all the systems that you have supporting you in training at the moment, that is the case. We sit on terabytes of data from Salisbury Plain, from Battus, and from Kenya that could be exploited. And finally, training is a deterrence and reassurance effect. So the deduction there is that your training systems must be deployable and interoperable with allies. And that isn't necessarily the case, although the system that you have in Kenya is deployable worldwide at 30 days' notice, something to bear in mind. So that's the context. What about the constraints that we see? First of all, historical and cultural. The way that training and simulation is introduced to individuals when they join the army, it shapes the way that generally you see the role of the training environment and the use of simulation. The doctrinal constraint of train as you fight. Really? How often is the God gun used to resurrect soldiers who would be casualties or vehicles that would be casualties at Salisbury Plain or in Canada in order so that those individuals get the best value out of the training time available? Procedural. Plan, refine, execute, evaluate. Well, I've touched on that already in terms of the exploitation of the enormous amount of data and information that is captured during every simulation-supported training event. You've got some organizational constraints. The battlefield is a multitude of entities. There's the collective individual training divide, which I think the use of simulation leaks across that division almost by accident rather than by design, but there are opportunities there for you to be able to introduce, as the Swedish armed forces do, simulation to the individual soldier from the day he or she joins the army. They are issued with their own TES equipment, which they see through to the end of their time. And then there's the mounted, dismounted platform division as well, being able to provide the dismounted soldier with the same connectivity and situational awareness that the mounted platform enjoys. Technical constraint, there are limits to what you've got. By and large, I think your suppliers keep you up to date, but there are commercial and contractual restrictions working both ways to support those or to further create those, sustain those limits. And bringing in emerging technologies also creates its risk. And finally, I think there's a commercial tension between what I describe as managing risk and enabling those technical developments. And we'll offer you a potential solution towards the end. Now, next, partnership. And as I said, there was a lot of talk about partnership with the Strategic Training Partnership nearly 5 years ago. And this, I think, was the generally agreed position that we would adopt, we, industry, and you as our partner. Sharing ethos, being bound together by trust, having equality in the relationship, getting beyond the customer-supplier divide, sharing objectives, outcomes, and most importantly, risk, which for you is in terms of your training levels and training outcomes, and for us, to be blunt, it's financial. So what can we do? How might we overcome that? Well, I think there's a role that we can play in helping you develop your training strategy. Planning, designing, delivering, evaluating, exploiting the training opportunities that you routinely program and run. Why? Because that allows you to maximize the technology that you have, getting the full value out of it. And it will also help you to look for solutions, future solutions, that are more agnostic in terms of location, where the training takes place, and the force mix. And at the same time, finding a solution that tries to help you cross that constraint between the collective and individual training domains. And you already do that to some extent. This photograph is of 4C strategies involved in KPI analysis at the end of a training exercise. The next element, perhaps, is looking again at the roles that industry has to play in terms of training delivery. And here we've got 3 photographs, one of industry involved in supporting exercise Urban Warrior in France I think 4 years ago, using tactical engagement simulation as a means of testing, allowing you to test urban tactics. Then we've got the in-place logistic and training support, which those of you who've been to Kenya will be fully familiar with. The contractor making sure that that soldiers understand how the technology works and it doesn't get in the way of effective training. And then finally, the provision of counter-ID collective training in Afghanistan, where industry was forward in Bastion, helping deliver that expertise in terms of training. My final point for you to consider is a new commercial model. Well, it's not new, you've got it in place already. To understand, you need to understand the incentives, both your incentives, better training outcomes, and us being able to get beyond the altruism of introducing new technology and also meeting our shareholders' requirements. So the challenge to you, I think, is to continue to buy black boxes, just technology, or move to a more service-orientated approach. And there is a method that is being explored, being put into practice with the Morpheus program. Huge program, far more complicated than the collective training environment, and indeed the individual synthetic training environment. But nevertheless, a service-orientated approach where the technology is not the issue, it's the information service that technology provides to subscribers, which is a model. You actually have an exemplar in place at the moment, and that is the provision of tactical engagement simulation in Kenya, where the risk is owned entirely by the supplier, Saab. You pay a premium for that, but it allows us to be able to introduce the latest technology, the latest versions, the latest models of the capability to you almost seamlessly. So that's something for you to consider. Almost there. So what have we covered? The key thing is working on removing those constraints. Period of constant change. I'd like you to think about continuing to develop your ideas of what partnership means, getting beyond the customer-supplier approach. Think about involving industry in designing your training strategy so that you get better use out of the technology that you've got and see the opportunities that future technologies may provide, and you better understand the risks that introducing those technologies will have to your training outputs and outcomes. there's definitely scope for making better use of industry in training, design, delivery, and evaluation, providing you with the opportunities for some continuity, perhaps freeing up some headroom in terms of uniform and soldiers. And finally, I think probably from an industry point of view, moving away from black box technology, which was the old way, into service provision where we can keep things dynamic and adaptive. And that's it.
And finally, the main event, General Ben Hodges, Commander of US Army Europe, who has done probably more than any other individual in NATO to put some substance behind assurance and deterrence, and how we have used training and activity to service those ends over the last couple of years. General, it's a great privilege.
Thank you, Patrick. Some of my own guys have never seen me wear these glasses before, but I've fallen into such disrepair I now need reading glasses. What I'd like to do right up front is assure everybody of the United States' commitment to security and stability in Europe. I acknowledge maybe there's been questions here over the last few months, but as your mother told you, actions speak louder than words and tweets. And so I would ask that you, when the United States is serious about something, it puts money on it and it puts soldiers on it. And so everything that was said during the last administration in 2016 at the NATO summit at Warsaw, it's all happening in 2017. In fact, we call 2017 the year of execution. Rotational forces, Armored Brigade Combat Team, Aviation Brigade, logistics, almost a full logistics brigade, that's all happening, and it's going to continue. Number two, preposition equipment, what we call APS, all the equipment for an armored division, it's still coming. We've already opened the sites in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. Zoetendaal will be opened up in Belgium. We're already using the former British site in Doelman in Germany, and of course Misal. And we'll be building the fifth and final site in Powice, Poland, which is west of Warsaw here it'll be completed by 2021. And then of course ERI, European Reassurance Initiative, not only is that continuing, the Congress has added an additional billion, that's with a B, for ERI, which is paying for these exercises, the APS, and all of that. So if you're not sure if the United States is committed, you're still stuck with me for a while anyway, and that equipment, that money, and that training. And I would also say the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group, of course, is in Orzic, Poland. We're very proud that there's a British company that's part of our battle group, as well as a Romanian air defense battery there in the northeast corner of Poland, and the Secretary of Defense, who today is in Germany at the Marshall Center celebrating the 70th anniversary of the issuing of the Marshall Plan, tweeted out that we are there for sure through the end of the administration. So I think that's pretty solid. Now, to the task here. This room is so full of people that I've known for many years, particularly British officers with whom I have served and under whom I have served. So I hope you know that anything that I may say that will be maybe contrary to what you're doing or thinking, or might even be slightly offending, you'll know that it was done out of complete respect and perhaps some ignorance. So 3 things saved the United States Army after Vietnam, and with great respect to Dave Kilcullen, who talked about sometimes you've got to get your ass kicked to really make the changes you need to make. And Secretary General Stoltenberg just the other day said that changing an organization is like trying to move a cemetery. The people that are there are not much help. So, but it took us getting thrashed in Vietnam as an Army to make the changes that need to be made. And the 3 things that were necessary to which we would attribute that change are the non-commissioned officer education system. We've always had NCOs, but the education system for our non-commissioned officers. The creation of the Combat Training Center, of course, the NTC, which many of you are familiar with, was the first, and then the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and of course the famous Joint Multinational Readiness Center at Hohenfels, Germany. Those 3 training centers. And then the third thing was the AAR, the After Action Review, critical self-analysis so that you can identify what's wrong, why did it go wrong, and how do you fix it. So what I'd like to talk briefly about, and by the way, Colonel Curtis Buzzard is in here. Curtis, raise your hand, stand back here. He's obviously not picked for his good looks, but he is probably one of the best colonels in the entire United States Army. He's the commander of the operations group at our training center at Hohenfels. There's no better trainer in the Army than Curtis. CTC's, Combat Training Center, that's how you change the Army. If you want to change the Army, you do it at the CTC. All the other things are an important part of it, but the reason you can change your Army at the training center is because, number one, everybody wants to beat the Op 4. So no matter what, even if you don't believe what's being put out at the schools or in the doctrinal publications, you will do whatever it takes to beat the Op 4, the professional Op 4, which is an essential part of the training center. And so that's how you get people to do camouflage, counterfire, talk secure, do the things that are necessary, get combined effects, and so on. So the CTC is where you do that. Number two, the observer controller trainers that are part of that training center. A good friend of mine described to me the OCTs as the conscience of the Army, because they're the standard bearer. They're the ones that say, this is how you do it. This is how you have to, if you want to achieve effect, not how you execute every task, but they're the conscience. And so investing quality people into the OCTs are an important part of that. And by the way, the battle group commander that we have in Northeast Poland right now, Colonel Steve Gaventer, when he changes command in 3 weeks, he is going straight to Hohenfels to be one of our battalion trainers. This is the place where we have plowed in all the lessons learned from Ukraine that Dr. Igor talked about earlier today that scared the hell out of everybody. The dreaded Op 4 now has the same sort of UAV capability, the overhead, the jamming, the fires, so that we have to practice against that. And then finally, at the training center, you do have to train to the threshold of failure. If you don't, then you're never going to develop the capability that Gareth talked about, as well as the confidence, because then you got to go back in there and do it again, and you keep doing it until you get it right. And so the AER process, and frankly, my favorite AER is not the one at the end, it's the in-stride AERs that are built into the process so that you can fix stuff while you're still there. But also, training to the threshold of failure requires, you got to go 24/7. I don't think you're serious about building readiness at your training center if you index at 2000 every day and then resume the fight at 8 o'clock the next morning. That's not how you're going to fight. I don't think the Taliban or the Russians will give us that opportunity. So if your training center is set up and it's not going 24/7 for the duration, then I don't think you really are going to develop and get the full benefit out of the investment that you're making. Now the training centers also, and training in general, because we're always going to fight with allies, or partners in some sort of coalition, you have to train with them. And what we have tried to do from Hohenfels is connect our simulation center with other simulation centers around Europe, as well as training centers, so that you can do distributed live virtual constructive training, multi-echelon. So you've got a corps headquarters, division headquarters, all the way down to squads that are in the field, and people doing it from, and we just did it from Cincu, Romania. So you had a Romanian division in their sim center tied into the French Rapid Reaction Corps, which was in our sim center. And then, of course, you had the box was full of troops on the ground. So that's the kind of capability. I have to admit, I have failed to make a compelling case to the British Army that Warminster ought to be connected in there as well, or wherever you have your different sim centers. We would like to be a part of that, to be able to do distributed training, which is, by the way, is exactly where I met Carsten Jakobsen the first time, doing a distributed command post exercise from the German sim center there in good old Wildflecken, part of a network that would allow us to also build interoperability. This is also a place where the NATO Standardization Office, I think, needs to step up and grow some teeth. I had assumed when I first heard about NSO that they were the enforcers, and I discovered they actually were only the keepers of the standards and the process. So Curtis Buzzard has reached out to the NSO when we invite them to our exercises so that they can help make sure that we are all meeting NATO standards. Also there at Grafenwehr, which is the live fire portion of our training center, the quality of the ranges, I'm obviously very proud of, and love it when other nations come and train there as well. And it was also the site of the second International Tank Challenge. You know, we used to have the great Canadian Armor Trophy all the time, and everybody prepared for that thing, and it was kind of made sure that you kept the level of the craft up to where it should be. So we have reinstituted that. We've done it 2 years in a row now. The goddamn Germans won the first one. They cheat like the Russian hockey team. It's, and then the Austrians won it this year. So I'm hoping that the great British Army will find their way all the way down from Sinaloa and participate next year. Patrick. Another part of training as you intend to fight, I mentioned allies. Of the 30,000 soldiers that move through Hohenfels every year, 30,000 over the course of the year, fully 50% of them are not American soldiers. They are allies or from PFP nations. That is the norm, because that's how we're going to have to fight. Our exercises, now speaking beyond the training center, you have to be op plan informed. Maybe not exercising the exact op plan for obvious reasons, but you got to practice all the pieces. And so what we just did in Sabre Strike last month, where we had Royal Marine Commandos and American helicopters seizing terrain north of Suwalki Gap, and then we took the Stryker Battalion out of Poland, and it drove up through the Suwalki Gap to link up with them and doing a river crossing in the process. Exactly what we would have to do if the scenario that Igor showed us earlier today with a Russian attempt to seal off the Suwalki Gap. Deploying into an exercise. As we speak, there is our 10th Combat Aviation Brigade is doing a convoy from Ansbach, Germany, all the way into Romania and Bulgaria. So well over 1,000 kilometers, they're making that move. And the Aviation Brigade commander told me, he's a great officer, he said, you know, we do night air assaults, we land in strange places, multinational. I love doing that. I'm not worried about that at all. This convoy scares the hell out of me. And they have, and CGS is the one that gave me the idea for doing these long convoys, that a chance to you find out your maintenance and you build confidence. So that's what they're doing now. They're deploying into the box all the way from central Germany into Romania. Meanwhile, 1st Squadron, 2nd Cavalry Regiment, deployed from Vilsec, started 2 days ago. They will do 3 different river crossings as they pass through Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria as part of the Sabre Guardian exercise, go into Varna, and they'll load up on ferries and sail across the Black Sea to join an exercise called Noble Partner in Georgia. So again, getting the training value plus demonstrating what it is we're capable of doing, and these exercises are part of deterrence. Let me touch one last thing about training as you fight. I would imagine, when you look at the threats that we have, I'm pretty sure the British Army is not going to have to fight the Canadians. You may be there to help protect them from us. We're going to try one more time. We tried once and failed. We'll give that another shot in a few years. But training in Europe, it's where all your allies are. It's where the terrain is, where you're most likely to fight. You've got the best chance to practice doing what you're going to do. And to be candid, you get 0 deterrent effect training in Canada. So if training is about deterrence, being in Europe versus where. Now, every country, including mine, makes decisions that you sometimes regret, or you understand it, you just don't like it for cost reasons. But I would ask that y'all consider that. Great ranges all over Germany, and of course in Poland and Hodges, Latvia. My last comment is going to be about speed and how this connects to, how does this connect to training? I think we will have 5 to 7 days unambiguous warning if Russia were ever to attack. Unambiguous warning. Of course, they'll do all they can to keep it ambiguous. That's what hybrid warfare is all about. We heard that earlier today. So when you talk about speed, in order to give our political leaders some options to be able to move forces around to prevent a crisis from ever happening, you need to recognize what's happening. And by the way, everything that we're going to do up short of Article 5, I am convinced, is going to be done under peacetime conditions. In other words, nobody's going to say, hey, don't worry about that border stuff, or don't worry, move your ammo wherever you want to go. Here you can have all of Deutsche Bahn None of that's going to happen. Because our political leaders, understandably, are going to do everything they can to preserve maximum flexibility to avoid being seen as provocative. So they're going to wait till the very last second. I went up to Wilhelmshaven to the German logistics center there and talked to the excellent group of officers who are responsible for every military movement in the Federal Republic of Germany. And he said, "Sir, don't worry, if it's a crisis, you'll be able to do all these things you want to do." I said, "Oh, great. Well, who determines if it's a crisis?" He said, "Well, of course, the Bundestag, the parliament." So I'm fairly certain they won't get it done inside 5 days. And so we have to assume that everything we're going to do pre-Article 5, to include launching the famous VJTF, anything else, is going to be done under peacetime conditions, which means everybody's border, EU road laws about moving fuel and ammunition, size of vehicles, every bit of that is going to be done under peacetime conditions. That's why we're spending millions of dollars in the U.S. Army to make all of our fuel and ammo vehicles ADR compliant, so we can move them around. That's why I'm paying the British Army for 18 hets so that we can move American tanks, because the American het does not have enough axles to meet the EU road restriction. This is what we're going to have to do. So speed of recognition, how fast can you figure out what the heck is going on? In a nasty cyber environment, we're getting bombarded with misinformation. The Russians have given passports to everybody that ever took a Russian class, and now Minister Lavrov has said, hey, it's our duty to protect all Russians. So they've created or planted the seeds for reasons to go in and do humanitarian things to save the poor Russians who are being abused in Lithuania or Latvia or somewhere else. So speed of recognition, which means you've got to be able to share intelligence and information. Speed of political decision. I just talked about how I believe our political leaders are going to use up all available time and flexibility to get decisions. That's nothing new. I mean, that's the way it's always going to be. So we've got to anticipate that, help them make that decision, understand the effects of not letting SACEUR deploy the VJTF, not letting us put reactive armor on vehicles, not letting us draw ammunition, not telling Deutsche Bahn, okay, all priority goes to VJTF or whatever. And then third, of course, speed of assembly. The diplomatic clearance required to move inside Germany, to move from Germany into Poland, is eye-watering. It's unbelievable. You have to have a roster. Here's the name of every vehicle, who's driving every vehicle and what's in every vehicle. I don't know who's driving me tomorrow. I am pretty sure that Alpha Company will not know 3 weeks from now when you turn that paperwork in who's going to be driving what vehicle or what the hell is even going to be in that vehicle. But that's the process that we're still having to deal with, and I have failed working with the Alliance to make a compelling enough case that we have got to create a military Schengen zone that would allow us to move at least as fast as a refugee across Central Europe. Now, the rail structure, all my old friends, the old guys I used to work for said, what are you whining about? We used to go from Aschaffenburg and Schweinfurt right up to Fulda. It took 3 hours. It was easy. To go from central Germany to Tallinn is the same thing as going from St. Louis, Missouri to Bangor, Maine, to provide a little perspective, the distances we're talking about. So that British battle group that's sitting up in Estonia, if they get isolated, we're talking a long time to get up there to relieve them or to help them. And remember, 5 to 7 days unambiguous warning. So rail infrastructure, bridges, Deutsche Bahn, when it became a commercial, when it went from Bundesbahn to Deutsche Bahn, not a big market for moving tanks around, so they don't have a lot of capacity for moving tanks, and we're all going to be competing for the same thing. So when my president, like every president since Eisenhower, said, allies have got to do more, just saying 2%, I don't know if that is, let me try and offer a shopping list. All right, to maybe make it easier and help your little 2% thermometer move up more quickly. Number one, guaranteed access to rail. Guaranteed access to rail for British forces, Polish, German, American, French, Dutch, so that we can move quickly. Somebody should be paying for that. Improved infrastructure. Railheads in Germany, fantastic. As you go east of Berlin, less fantastic. They are fine for a T-72. They're not good for a Challenger or Leopard or Abrams tank to rapidly unload, and there's not enough of them in the right places. Somebody should pay for that. Improve the infrastructure there. Bridges. To go from Germany to the Baltics, you're going to cross 8 major rivers, starting with the Oder River, that are at least as big an obstacle as the Thames. at least. And then there's about 3,000 more water crossings you're going to have to do as you move across northern Poland and up into Lithuania. And I guarantee you, not many bridges out there have that little yellow sign on them that says 100 with a military load classification. And then, of course, again, decision by a great ally to move troops out of Sinalager back into, back here. That's it. And I know I'm on thin ice as an ally commenting on internal decisions about an ally. Okay, but that's why I preambled it. I'm sure I was so surrounded by friends that you would take it in the spirit this is said. Just like everybody hates that our aviation brigade in Germany got wiped out and was sent home. So now we're having to undo that mistake and use rotational aviation. When you move from Sinalager, you've just added a couple of minor obstacles to get back into the fight. The Channel, moving through France, moving through the Netherlands, or however you're going to go. And of course, if it is a crisis, the Russians are not just going to sit on their guns in Kaliningrad and allow you to sail up into the Baltic Sea. So, but we all have to make decisions. That speed is an essential part of deterrence. And finally, Germany is now the COMZ, what we used to call the COMZ, the communication zone. Poland is our center of gravity. Armor Brigade, Aviation, Forward Operating Site in Poland, and EFP. So we have moved our center of gravity eastward into Poland, all rotational forces, so that we're closer with combat power, logistics, and the ability to project troops coming from the U.S. that would then go there in case of a crisis. And Germany is the transit zone. It is the communication zone. Ramstein Air Base for us, Bremerhaven, fantastic port, and of course, wherever else you land in Europe, you're going to have to pass through Germany anyway. So that's how we've reorganized. Sir, thank you very much.